Vel-Shara Station hung in the blackness of space like a jewel made of glass and steel, spinning slowly at the crossroads of 12 civilizations that believed they had conquered war itself. Sergeant Cale Morrow stood at the viewport of Docking Bay 9 and watched the station turn beneath him, its rings glittering with the lights of 100,000 lives, and he thought about how easy it would be to lose everything here if the wrong people made the wrong choices. He had been on the station for 3 weeks now, assigned as the head of security for the human diplomatic envoy, and in those 3 weeks, he had learned 2 things about the galaxy. First, that every alien species believed humans were barely more than clever animals who had stumbled into space travel by accident. And second, that the aliens were not entirely wrong about how dangerous humans could be, though they had no idea just how right they were. The order came down on a Tuesday, which Cale always thought was a terrible day for the universe to change. Ambassador Lena Voss stormed into the security office with a tablet in her hand and fury on her face, and she slapped the tablet onto his desk hard enough to crack the screen protector. "Read it," she said. Cale picked it up and read the official decree from the Concord of 12, the governing body of the elder species who ran the station and most of civilized space. The Universal Arms Prohibition, effective immediately, banned all projectile weapons, all energy-based firearms, all ballistic systems, and all explosive devices from every Concord station, vessel, and diplomatic zone in the galaxy. Cale read it twice and then set the tablet down very carefully. "They want our guns," he said. "Every single one," Voss replied, and she dropped into the chair across from him like someone who had just been punched in the stomach, but was too proud to fall down. "Every sidearm, every rifle, every shotgun, every round of ammunition, every spare magazine, everything." "When?" "Now, Cale. They want them right now." He leaned back in his chair and stared at the ceiling for a long moment. The thing about humans and guns was simple. Guns were the backbone of human combat doctrine, and they had been for 500 years, and every human soldier from the lowest private to the highest general understood that a firearm was the great equalizer, the tool that let a small person stop a large person, that let one defender hold a corridor against 10 attackers, that let humanity punch above its weight in a galaxy full of species that were bigger and stronger and tougher. And now the Concord had taken that away, with a vote and a decree and a polite smile. The Velkari inspector arrived within the hour. His name was Tukral, and he was tall and thin and covered in a chitinous exoskeleton the color of dark amber, with compound eyes that reflected the light like broken mirrors, and he moved with the precise clicking efficiency of a species that had been organizing things into neat categories for longer than humans had been walking upright. He stood in the doorway of the human armory and watched as Cale's security team began pulling weapons from racks and placing them into Concord-sealed transport crates. 12 sidearms, Chiral counted, his mandibles clicking softly as he spoke through his translator. 8 combat rifles, 4 shotguns, 2 precision rifles, and ammunition stores totaling approximately 14,000 rounds. "You can count," Cale said flatly. "Your species' obsession with propelling metal at high speed was always rather quaint," Chiral said, and there was something in his tone that sat right on the edge between pity and contempt. "The Velkari abandoned such crude methods of conflict resolution before your kind had learned to plant seeds in dirt." Cale said nothing, and he watched his people hand over their weapons with the grim faces of soldiers who were being asked to cut off their own hands. Corporal Ria Vasquez was the last one to surrender her sidearm, and she held it for a moment longer than necessary, and Cale saw her jaw tighten before she placed it gently into the crate, like she was laying a child into a coffin. The crates were sealed and carried away, and the armory stood empty, and the silence in that room was the loudest thing Cale had ever heard. Chiral made a note on his own tablet and looked up at Cale with those fractured mirror eyes. Your delegation is now in full compliance with the Universal Arms Prohibition, he said. I trust this will not be an inconvenience. Not at all, Kale said, and his voice was perfectly even. Chiral left, and his footsteps clicked away down the corridor. And Kale stood alone in the empty armory for a full minute before he moved. He walked to his personal quarters, which were small and plain and smelt faintly of gun oil and coffee, and he locked the door behind him, and he knelt beside his bunk and pulled out a case from underneath it. The case was black and unremarkable, and had never been flagged by any Concord scanner because it contained no propellants, no energy cells, no ballistic components, and no explosive materials. He opened it. Inside, mounted in custom-cut foam with the care and precision of a museum display, lay an arsenal that stretched back through the entire bloody history of the human species. A pair of Japanese tantos with wrapped handles and edges that could split a hair lengthwise. A curved karambit from Southeast Asia designed to hook and tear. A Nepalese kukri with its distinctive forward-angled blade that the Gurkhas had used to terrify empires. A Scottish dirk with a leather-wrapped grip. A Roman gladius that was a faithful replica of the blade that had built and destroyed the greatest empire of the ancient world. A pair of butterfly knives from the Philippines. A tactical tomahawk with a matte black head. 6 perfectly balanced throwing knives in a leather roll. And at the center of it all, resting in its own space like a king on a throne, a custom-machined combat Bowie knife with a 12-inch blade and a handle made of dark carbon fiber. He called it Sermon. He lifted it from the foam and held it up, and the overhead light ran along the edge like water over glass. The Concord of 12 had outlawed guns, and they had done it with the smug confidence of species who had evolved past the need for sharp objects and close combat, and the raw animal willingness to get within arm's reach of something that wanted to kill you and make it die first. They had forgotten something that humans had never forgotten, something that was written into the bones and blood and 2-million-year history of a species, and had started its journey to the stars by picking up a sharp rock, deciding that the darkness was not going to win. Kale sheathed Sermon on his hip and smiled. They had said no guns. They had not said a single word about knives. And then the alarms began to scream. Every light on the station flashed red, and a sound tore through the corridors that Kale recognized instantly, because it was the same in every language and on every world. The sound of something terrible arriving uninvited. The station's communication system crackled to life, and a voice that was not part of the Concord, a voice that was rough and deep and full of hunger, announced that the Raktari marauders had locked the station's jump drives and disabled the emergency escape pods. No one was leaving, and every defender on the station had just handed over their weapons. Kale tightened his grip on Sermon and headed for the door. The wolves were here, and the shepherds had thrown away their staffs, and now someone was going to have to do this the old way, the very old way. The Raktari came through the lower docking rings like a flood of teeth and armor, and the station shook with the sound of their boarding clamps biting into the hull. Kale reached the security office in under 2 minutes, and found his team already there. 12 humans standing in a room that now had no gun rack, no ammunition locker, and nothing on the walls but empty hooks where weapons used to hang. They looked at him, and he looked at them, and nobody said a word about how bad this was, because they already knew. He dropped the black case onto the table and opened it, and the blades caught the emergency lighting and threw red reflections across the ceiling like small angry stars. "Pick what fits you," he said. Corporal Ria Vasquez stepped forward first and reached for the kukri without hesitation. And when her hand closed around the grip, something shifted in her face, something old and certain and not at all afraid. The tactical tomahawk and the Scottish dirk, one for each hand, and he tested the weight of them with the easy confidence of someone who had grown up splitting firewood on a farm in Poland before the recruiters found him. Specialist Annika Ewan chose the butterfly knives and flicked them open and closed 3 times in a blur that made no sound at all, and she nodded once. The rest of the team armed themselves, and when the case was empty, Kale looked at his people and saw something that the Concord of 12 would not have understood. He saw 12 humans who had been stripped of every advantage that modern warfare could offer, and instead of breaking, they had reached back through 10,000 years of history and picked up the tools their ancestors had used to claw their way to the top of every food chain on every continent of a world that had tried very hard to kill them. "Rules of engagement," Kale said, and his voice was calm and quiet the way a river is calm and quiet right before it goes over a waterfall. The Roktari are not Concord members, so the arms ban does not protect them, and they have hostages on the civilian decks, so we cannot be reckless, and there are hundreds of them and 12 of us, so we will not fight fair. He paused. We will fight human. The first engagement happened 19 minutes later, in a narrow service corridor on Deck 7. Kale took 3 operatives, Vasquez, Brandt, and a quiet man named Sergeant Omar Fidel, who carried the Gladius like he had been born with it in his hand. And they moved through the maintenance tunnels until they were ahead of a marauder patrol. The Roktari were reptilian and massive, each one standing nearly 7 feet tall, with thick scaled hides and jaws that could crush bone. And they carried serrated plasma-edge polearms that hummed with a sick orange light, and they moved through the corridor with the lazy confidence of predators who believed nothing on this station could hurt them. Kale killed the lights. The corridor went black, and for the Roktari, whose eyes were adapted to the bright desert suns of their homeworld, the darkness was absolute. For the humans, who had spent 2 million years as nocturnal hunters on the African savanna before they ever built a fire, the darkness was home. The first marauder died without making a sound, and the second one managed a short hiss of surprise before the Gladius found the gap between his neck scales. And by the time the remaining 6 realized what was happening and began swinging their polearms in wide panicked arcs, the corridor was too narrow for the long weapons to be effective, and the humans were too close, and it was already over. It took 40 seconds. Kale wiped Sermon on the leg of his pants and listened to the silence that followed, and it was a different kind of silence than the one in the empty armory, and it felt much better. Above, in the main security monitoring center, Chiral the Velkari inspector stood in front of a bank of screens and watched the camera feeds with all 4 of his compound eyes wide open. He had watched the engagement on Deck 7 in its entirety, and he had not moved, and he had not spoken, and the small hairs on his thorax that his species used to sense air pressure and vibration were standing straight up in a pattern that indicated extreme distress. On the screen next to that feed, he could see the Dalveen delegates, tall, willowy beings with translucent skin and enormous dark eyes, huddled in a diplomatic shelter, their empathic abilities overwhelmed by the violence flooding the station, several of them catatonic and trembling. On another screen, a group of Torvani, massive silicon-based giants who stood 9 feet tall and weighed as much as small vehicles, were holding a barricade at a corridor junction, their stone-like bodies absorbing hits from marauder weapons, but they were slow, and the marauders were flanking them, and it was only a matter of time. On every screen the story was the same. The Concord species were losing, because they had spent 10,000 years building a civilization that solved problems with technology and diplomacy and psionic fields, and they had forgotten what it meant to fight with your hands, to close the distance, to make it personal. And on one small screen in the corner, Tiral watched a human woman with a curved knife take apart a Roktari hunting party in a cargo bay like she was conducting surgery. Corporal Vasquez had gotten separated from her team when a blast door malfunction cut her off from the others, and she had found herself in a cargo bay the size of a cathedral. surrounded by shipping containers stacked 3 high, and 9 marauders had followed her in. Taral watched her disappear between the containers, and for a moment he thought she was hiding. And then the first marauder fell, and then the second, and he realized she was not hiding at all. She was hunting. She used the containers for cover and for height, and she used the zero-gravity pockets near the bay's malfunctioning gravity plates to change direction in ways that the heavy marauders could not follow. And she threw 2 knives with a precision that was almost mechanical, each one finding the soft tissue under a marauder's jaw. And when she ran out of throwing knives, she closed the distance with the kukri and did the rest by hand. She took wounds, and Titral could see the red blood on her arm and her side, and she kept going. And the look on her face was not rage, and it was not fear, and it was not madness. It was focus. It was the look of a species that had been doing this for so long that it was not a choice anymore, but a reflex, written into the muscles and the nerves and the ancient lizard brain that sat underneath all the civilization and the mob. Diplomacy and the polite smiles. The last marauder tried to run, and she caught it. A young Velkari security officer standing beside Chiral watched the same feed, and his mandibles were trembling, and he turned to Chiral and whispered a question that was not really a question at all. "What are they?" Chiral did not answer, because for the first time in his long career of cataloging and inspecting and judging the species of the galaxy, he did not have a category for what he was seeing. The station's communication system crackled again, and the voice of the marauder warlord, Scarvoth, filled every corridor and every room with a sound like gravel being crushed under a boot. "This station belongs to the Raktari now," he announced, and there was amusement in his voice, the easy confidence of someone who held all the cards. "Surrender your ambassadors and your cargo, or I will vent the civilian decks and let the vacuum sort out who is worth keeping alive." He laughed, and it was an ugly sound. "What will you fight with?" he asked. "You disarmed yourselves like fools, and now you will die like prey." There was a pause, and then a different voice came over the channel. A human voice, calm and steady and carrying a weight that had nothing to do with volume. "Not all of us," Kale said, and somewhere in the dark corridors of Velshara Station, a blade caught the emergency light and flashed once, like a promise. Kale split his team into cells of 3 and sent them into the bones of the station, like white blood cells hunting an infection. The plan was simple, because the best plans always are. Move through the maintenance shafts and ventilation systems that the marauders were too large to fit through. Hit them in small groups where their numbers meant nothing. Disappear before they could organize a response. And do it again and again and again until the enemy understood that the station was not theirs and never would be. The Raktari were strong and savage and brutal, but they were also used to fighting enemies who stood in front of them and tried to match their strength, because that was how war worked on their burning desert world. 2 armies crashing together under a red sun until one of them stopped moving. They had never fought humans before. They had never fought anything like humans before. In the first 6 hours of the guerrilla campaign, Kale's 12 operatives killed 43 marauders and lost 0 of their own, and the Raktari did not know how to make it stop. The humans came from the ventilation grates above, and from the maintenance hatches below, and they came from behind sealed doors that should have been locked, and they came from inside rooms that had already been cleared. And every time the marauders turned around to fight, there was nobody there, and every time they turned back, someone was bleeding. Kale moved through the station like a ghost with sermon in his hand, and he learned the corridors the way a hunter learns a forest, by feel and by smell and by the sound that different floors made under different boots. And he could tell where the marauders were by the vibration of their heavy footsteps through the metal walls. On deck 12, Brant in his cell caught a group of 5 marauders guarding a sealed bulkhead. And Brant used the tomahawk to breach a wall panel and come through the side. His team came from above and below, and the Marauders never even got their weapons up. On Deck 8, Specialist Ewan walked into a room full of 3 Marauders with her butterfly knives hidden against her forearms, and she smiled at them. And they hesitated because she was small and unarmed, and they did not understand why she was smiling. And by the time they understood, it was too late. In the diplomatic shelter on Deck 15, the world was quieter, but no less tense. Ambassador Lena Voss sat in a room with delegates from 6 different Concord species, and the air was thick with fear and the strange electric hum of the Dalveen empaths trying to contain the emotional shockwaves that were rolling through the station like invisible storms. 3 of the Dalveen had gone catatonic, their translucent bodies curled into fetal positions on the floor, their enormous dark eyes open but seeing nothing, overwhelmed by the violence that their species had spent millennia trying to evolve away from. A Torvani delegate named Gorvin, a silicon giant with a face like a cliff wall and hands like boulders, stood by the door and watched the corridor outside, and he turned to Voss with an expression that was hard to read on a face made of living stone, but which she recognized as something close to grudging curiosity. "Your soldiers," he said, and his voice sounded like 2 rocks grinding together. "They fight with hand tools." "Bladed weapons," Voss corrected gently. "How is this possible?" he said, and it was not a question so much as a statement of confusion. "We were told humans fight with projectile weapons, that your species cannot compete without them, that you are soft and fragile and slow." "We are soft," Voss said, "and we are fragile compared to your kind, and we are slower than the Velkari, and weaker than the Rakthari, and less psychically gifted than the Dalveen." She paused. "And none of that has ever stopped us." Gorvin stared at her, and another delegate, a Velkari communication specialist who had been monitoring channels, leaned forward with interest. "Tell us," Gorvin said. And so Voss told them. She told them about the gladius, the short sword of Rome, a blade no longer than a human forearm that had conquered the entire known world 2,000 years ago, not because it was the biggest weapon or the sharpest weapon, but because the Romans understood that in close formation fighting, a short stabbing blade was more lethal than any long slashing sword, and that the willingness to get close enough to smell your enemy's breath was worth more than any amount of reach. She told them about the Gurkhas of Nepal, mountain warriors who carried the kukri, a forward curved blade that could take a limb off with a single swing, and whose reputation was so terrifying that entire enemy battalions surrendered rather than face them. And she told them the old saying, that a Gurkha who draws his kukri must draw blood before sheathing it, even if the blood must be his own. She told them about the Filipino knife fighters who developed an art called eskrima that turns small blades into extensions of the hand and the arm and the entire body, a flowing system of cuts and blocks and redirections that was so efficient it looked like dancing until you noticed the red. She told them about the Japanese swordsmiths who folded steel thousands of times until the blade could cut falling silk, and about the samurai who believed that the sword was the soul of the warrior, and about a code of honor that said it was better to die with a blade in your hand than to live having surrendered one. She told them about the Bowie knife and the men who carried it into the wild places of a young nation, and about the trench knives of the first great wars, and about the commandos who crawled through darkness with blackened blades to do the work that no gun could do quietly enough. The aliens listened, and the room grew very still. The Velkari communication specialist clicked his mandibles softly and said, "These are all different weapons." "Yes," Voss said. "From different cultures." "Yes." "On the same planet?" "Every culture on Earth developed its own bladed weapons independently," Voss said, Every single one, from the frozen north to the burning equator to the islands in the middle of the ocean, every group of humans who ever lived looked at the world around them and decided that the first thing they needed was something sharp. Gorvin was quiet for a long time, and then he asked the question that Voss had been waiting for, the question that she knew would change how they saw her species. How long have humans been making these? Voss looked at him steadily. About 2 million years, she said. The first stone blades came before language, before fire, before we were even fully human in the way we are now. Our ancestors picked up rocks and broke them until they had an edge. And they used that edge to cut meat and scrape hides and defend themselves against predators that were bigger and faster and stronger than they were. She let that settle. You could say that blades made us who we are, that the knife is the oldest human technology, older than the wheel, older than writing, older than agriculture, older than everything except walking upright and using our hands. The Dalveen empath who was still conscious, a tall and trembling being named Selvan, looked at Voss with those enormous dark eyes and whispered something that the translator almost could not catch. You never put them down. Voss shook her head. We never had the luxury. The station shook, and the lights flickered, and somewhere far away there was a sound like thunder, and everyone in the room knew that the marauders were getting desperate. Came through on the emergency channel in Scarvoth's grinding voice, and it said that he was pulling his forces back to the station's command center, and that he had rigged the civilian life support systems with explosive charges, and that if anyone tried to stop him, he would kill every civilian on the station by shutting off their air. Voss closed her eyes for a moment, and when she opened them, they were hard. She activated her communicator. Kale. I heard, he said, and his voice was steady. We are already moving. How many do you have left? 7 standing, all of them bleeding, none of them stopping. Voss looked at the aliens around her, the frightened Dalveen and the stone-faced Torvani, and the clicking Velkari, and she thought about 2 million years of sharp things and the people who carried them. Bring them home, Sergeant. Yes, ma'am, Kale said, and the channel went quiet, and somewhere in the dark guts of the station, 7 humans with knives began moving toward the most heavily fortified position on Valshara, and not one of them hesitated. The command center of Velshara Station sat at the heart of the central atrium, a reinforced bunker of hardened alloy and blast-resistant glass that overlooked a vast open space, 5 stories tall and 200 meters wide. And Scarvoth had turned it into a fortress. 40 marauders held the atrium floor and the catwalks above it, armed with acid launchers that could melt through steel and plasma-edge polearms that could cut a human in half. And they had clear sight lines in every direction, and there was no cover between the entry points and the command center doors. Kale looked at the layout on a stolen security tablet and did the math in his head, and the math was very bad. 7 humans with knives against 40 entrenched marauders in an open killing field, and behind those marauders was a warlord with his finger on the trigger of a bomb that would suffocate 10,000 civilians. He had fought in bad situations before, but this was not a bad situation. This was an impossible one, and for a brief moment he allowed himself to feel the weight of that before he set it aside and started thinking about how to make the impossible merely terrible. The answer came from the aliens. It came from Teachral first, who appeared in the maintenance corridor where Kale's team was regrouping, moving with the silent clicking gait of his species, and who said without preamble, I can access the station's communication grid and scramble Rakthari frequencies for approximately 90 seconds before they adapt. Kale looked at him. Why, he asked, because 6 hours ago, the same inspector had smugly watched humans surrender their weapons and called them quaint. Teatral's compound eyes reflected 7 battered humans in their fractured surfaces, and his mandibles moved in a pattern that the translator interpreted as something between shame and resolve. Because I watched your people fight for a station that is not theirs, to protect species that have treated them with contempt, and I find that I am unable to do less than an insect should." Then came Gorvin and 4 other Torvani, each one a walking mountain of living silicon, and Gorvin said in his grinding stone voice, "We will go first into the atrium. The acid burns our skin, but it does not melt us. We can absorb what your bodies cannot." And then, most surprisingly of all, came 3 Dalvine empaths, including Selvan, who was still trembling, and whose translucent skin was flickering with the emotional overload of the station's violence, and who said in a voice like wind through crystal, "We can project fear directly into the minds of the Raktari. Not for long, perhaps 30 seconds, but for those 30 seconds, they will feel what prey feels when it knows the predator is close." Kale looked at the Dalvine, a species of pacifists who had not raised a hand in violence for 10,000 years, and he saw what it cost them to make this offer. The way Selvan's hands shook, and the way the other 2 empaths held each other as if they might fly apart. "You do not have to do this," he said. "No," Selvan agreed, "but your Corporal Vasquez did not have to fight 9 marauders alone in a cargo bay either, and she did. And if a human can bleed for us, then a Dalvine can scream for you." Kale nodded once, and that was all the ceremony any of them needed. They hit the atrium at 0347 station time. Trawls scrambled the marauder communications first, and the chatter between their squads turned to static. And for 90 precious seconds, 40 marauders became 40 individuals who could not coordinate. The Torvani went in next, 5 living boulders charging across the open floor, and the acid launchers opened up and sprayed them with streams of corrosive liquid that hissed and smoked against their silicon hides. And the Torvani roared in pain, but they did not stop. They could not be stopped. They were mountains, and mountains do not fall terrain. And then the Dalvine screamed. It was not a sound that traveled through the air, it was a sound that traveled through the mind, and every Raktari in the atrium felt it hit them like a wall of ice water, a wave of pure primal terror that reached into the oldest part of their reptilian brains and squeezed. For 30 seconds, the most savage warriors in the quadrant felt what a mouse feels when the shadow of a hawk passes over it, and their hands went slack on their weapons, and their eyes went wide, and some of them actually stepped backward. Into that gap came 7 humans with knives. They came through the entry points on 3 sides, running low and fast, and Kale was at the front, with Sermon in his right hand, and the blade was an extension of his arm, and his arm was an extension of his will, and his will was a simple and ancient thing that had no room for doubt. Left flank with her kukri, and tore through 2 marauders before they even understood what was happening, and the blood that flew from her blade was black in the emergency lighting, and she moved like water over rocks, flowing around the polearms that swung at her, and finding the gaps in Rakthari armor that her hands knew were there, the way a river knows where the cracks in stone are. Brant took the right side with his tomahawk and dirk, using the tomahawk to hook marauder weapons aside, and the dirk to finish what the opening created. And he fought with the mechanical efficiency of a machine that had been built for exactly this purpose. Ewan and Fatal moved through the center like a paired blade, covering each other's blind spots, and Ewan's butterfly knives were a blur that sang in the air, and Fatal's gladius punched through Rakthari chest plates with the short, efficient thrusts that the Roman legions had perfected 2,000 years ago. The fight was not clean. It was not quick, and the 30 seconds of Dalvine terror ran out, and the marauders began to recover, and the 90 seconds of scrambled communications ended, and Scarvoth began screaming orders, and the Torvani were slowing down under the sustained acid fire, and the humans were taking hits. Kale felt a plasma-edge blade slice across his left shoulder, and the pain was enormous and bright. And he did not stop, because stopping meant dying, and dying meant 10,000 civilians choking in the dark, and that was not acceptable. That was never going to be acceptable. He reached the command center doors and found them sealed, and Brant was beside him, with blood running down his face from a cut above his eye. And together they used the tomahawk to pry the emergency release, and the doors ground open, and Kale went through. Scarvoth was waiting. The warlord stood 9 feet tall in the center of the command center, his scaled hide the color of dried blood, his yellow eyes burning with a rage that was almost beautiful in its purity. And he held a plasma edge halberd that was longer than Kale was tall. And behind him, bolted to the life support console, was the explosive device that would kill everyone on the station. "A human," Scarvoth said, and his voice was thick with disbelief and something that might have been amusement. "A small, soft human with a knife." He swung the halberd in a wide arc that would have cut Kale in half at the waist, and Kale dropped under it, so close that he felt the plasma edge singe the hair on the back of his neck. "You cannot win this," Scarvoth said, and he swung again, and Kale dodged again, and the tip of the halberd carved a glowing line across the floor. The warlord was right about the math, because he was bigger and stronger and had more reach, and was wearing armor that Sermon could barely scratch, and in any fair calculation, Kale should have been dead in the first 10 seconds. But Kale had not come here to win a fair fight. He had come here to deliver a sermon. He closed the distance, and Scarvoth hit him, a backhand swing of the halberd shaft that cracked ribs and sent him stumbling. And Kale used the stumble to get closer, and he put Sermon into the gap between the warlord's hip plates, and Scarvoth roared and swung again, and Kale took the hit and stayed close and cut again. That was the secret of the knife, the thing the Concord had forgotten and the Marauders had never understood. A knife demands that you get close, that you stay close, that you accept that you will be hurt in order to hurt the thing that needs hurting. And a species that was willing to do that had been doing that for 2 million years, was more dangerous than any gun or any energy weapon or any psionic field could ever be. Because guns let you kill from a distance, and distance is a kind of mercy. But a knife makes you look your enemy in the eye, and choose to keep going. Kale kept going. He took wounds that should have dropped him, a gash across his thigh, a hit to his already broken ribs, a cut on his forearm that went to the bone. And each time he paid in blood, he bought another opening, and each opening he filled with Sermon. And Scarvoth began to slow, not from any single wound, but from dozens of them, 100 small cuts that bled and bled and bled. The warlord fell to one knee, and his yellow eyes were wide with something Kale recognized, because he had seen it in the eyes of every predator that had ever realized it was no longer the most dangerous thing in the room. It was fear. Scarvoth died on the floor of the command center, and Kale stood over him, swaying and soaked in blood, both red and black, and he reached past the body with hands that shook so badly he could barely control them, and he deactivated the explosive device, and then he sat down very carefully on the floor. Legs had decided they were finished. The station went quiet. In the atrium, the surviving Marauders dropped their weapons and knelt, and the Torvani stood over them like mountains standing over fallen trees, and the Dalveen empaths collapsed from exhaustion, and 7 humans leaned against walls and sat on floors and bled from wounds that would take weeks to heal. But they were alive, and so was everyone else. 3 days after the siege ended, the bodies had been cleared and the blood had been cleaned from the floors, and the station had begun to breathe again. And the Concord of 12 called an emergency session in the High Chamber to decide what to do about the humans. The High Chamber was a circular room at the top of the station's central spire, ringed with tall windows that looked out into the stars. And the delegations of the 12 elder species sat in ascending tiers around a central floor, where speakers stood to make their case. and the room was designed to make anyone standing at the center feel very small. Ambassador Lena Voss stood at the center and did not feel small at all. The charges against the human delegation were read by a Velkari legal arbiter in a flat, clicking voice. The humans had carried concealed weapons aboard a Concord station in violation of the spirit of the Universal Arms Prohibition. The humans had engaged in lethal combat without Concord authorization. The humans had caused significant structural damage to station infrastructure, and the humans had killed 87 sentient beings. Voss listened to the charges with her hands folded in front of her, and her face perfectly calm. And when the arbiter finished, she waited 3 seconds before responding, because she had learned long ago that silence was a weapon too. "And how many sentient beings did we save?" she asked. The chamber was quiet. 10,412, she answered her own question. That is the number of civilians who were still breathing air when the last marauder surrendered. 10,412 lives that were on the edge of being extinguished because a warlord had his hand on a switch. And the only thing between those lives and the vacuum was a handful of humans with knives. A delegate from the Shral Collective, a species of floating crystalline beings who communicated through light patterns, pulsed an objection. The humans had technically violated the prohibition, and if the Concord allowed this to stand, it would set a precedent that any species could carry concealed weapons by claiming cultural significance. Voss nodded. "You are right," she said. "We did carry weapons onto this station, and we did so knowingly, and I will not stand here and pretend otherwise. But I want this chamber to understand something about why we did it." She looked around the room at the 12 species who had built a civilization that stretched across a galaxy. Species who had mastered gravity and bent light and touched the minds of others across the void. Species who were older and wiser and more powerful than humanity in every way that could be measured. "You outlawed guns," she said, "and that was your right, and we complied, because we want to be part of this Concord and we respect its laws. But when you wrote that law, you made an assumption that we find troubling." She paused. "You assumed that taking away our guns would make us harmless." The chamber was very still. "Guns are 400 years old," Voss said. "Before guns we had swords, and before swords we had spears, and before spears we had rocks with sharp edges, and before rocks we had our hands and our teeth and our willingness to use them. And the thing you need to understand about humans is that we did not become dangerous when we invented firearms. We have always been dangerous, and we will always be dangerous, and no law and no decree and no prohibition will ever change that, because our danger does not come from our weapons." She placed her hand over her heart. "It comes from here, from the thing inside us that looks at a 9-foot reptilian warlord holding a bomb and says, 'No, not today, not these people, not on my watch.'" She lowered her hand. "You can take our guns, and we will fight with knives, and you can take our knives, and we will fight with our hands, and you can take our hands, and we will fight with our teeth. We do not stop. We have never stopped. We have been fighting since before we could speak, since before we could think in words, since the first of our ancestors picked up a sharp stone on an African plain and decided that they were not going to be prey anymore." The silence in the chamber was absolute. "So you can sanction us," Voss said. "You can revoke our membership and send us back to our little corner of the galaxy and tell yourselves that you are safer without us. But I want you to think very carefully about what happened 3 days ago, about what would have happened if we had not been here, about what would have happened if the Rakthari had come to this station and found nobody willing to stand in their way." She let that thought sit in the room like a blade on a table. "We are not asking you to like us," she said. "We are asking you to let us stand between you and the dark, the way we have always stood with whatever we have in our hands." She stepped back from the center, and the chamber erupted into debate. In a small office 3 levels below the high chamber, Chadral sat at his desk and finalized the report that the Velkari delegation had asked him to write. the report that was supposed to recommend sanctions and punitive measures against the human delegation. He had written a different report. His recommendation was to reclassify bladed weapons carried by human personnel not as arms under the Universal Arms Prohibition, but as cultural artifacts protected under the Concord's Heritage Preservation Clause. And his reasoning was 12 pages of precise legal and logical argument that boiled down to a single conclusion. The humans did not circumvent the ban, he had written. They simply reminded us that the ban was written by species who forgot what a weapon truly is. A weapon is not a technology. It is not a form of advancement, mechanism, or a device, or a system. A weapon is an intention, and humans have been intentional for a very long time. And I do not believe any law we write will change that. Nor, having seen what their intention accomplished 3 days ago, do I believe it should. He submitted the report, and sat back in his chair, and looked at his own reflection in the dark screen of his terminal. And he thought about the footage he had watched, about the human woman with the curved knife, and the human sergeant who had walked into a room with a monster and walked out again. And he thought about how small and soft and fragile they were, and how none of that had mattered. The vote took 6 hours. The Shral Collective voted to sanction, and the Morvathi hegemony abstained, and the Dalveen voted against sanctions with a passion that surprised everyone, Selvan speaking on their behalf with a voice that no longer trembled. They bled for us, Selvan said, and they did not ask permission first, and they did not calculate whether we were worth it. They simply came, and I will not vote to punish that. Gorvin spoke for the Torvani, and his stone voice filled the chamber like the sound of a mountain settling. I have lived for 300 years, and I have never seen a species fight the way the humans fight, he said. Not with the most strength or the most technology, but with the most refusal to accept defeat. And I would rather have them beside me than against me. The vote failed, and the sanctions were not imposed, and humanity's provisional membership in the Concord of 12 was upgraded to full membership, with all rights and privileges, and a new clause was quietly added to the Universal Arms Prohibition. It was called the Morrow Exception, and it stated that members of the Concord were permitted to carry traditional edged cultural implements for personal defense, subject to a maximum blade length and a registry requirement. It was understood by everyone who read it that the clause existed because of one species and one species alone. 2 weeks later, when the station had returned to something like normal, and the diplomatic delegations had resumed their work, and the Rakthari marauders were being escorted to a Concord prison facility, Kale sat in a bar on Deck 6, with his arm in a sling, and bandages around his ribs, and sermon sheathed at his hip. Charal sat across from him. It was the first time the inspector had voluntarily shared a table with a human, and for a long time they sat in a silence that was not uncomfortable, but was full of things that neither of them quite knew how to say. Charal ordered a drink that smelled like warm copper, and Kale ordered a whiskey, and they sat and watched the stars turn outside the viewport. Finally, Charal spoke. Your species truly carried blades before you could speak? Before we could think in words, Kale said. Before we had language, or fire, or anything else, we had sharp edges, and you never stopped. Never had a reason to. Thrall studied him with those compound eyes that reflected the starlight in 100 tiny fragments. And then slowly, with a deliberateness that suggested ritual, he reached beneath his thorax plate and produced a small object. It was a claw blade, a curved sliver of hardened chitin mounted on a grip of woven fiber, and it was old, impossibly old, the kind of old that meant it had been passed down through so many generations that its origin had become legend. The Valkyrie carried these once, Thrall said quietly. 10,000 years ago, before we decided that such things were beneath us, before we put them in museums and told ourselves we had evolved beyond the need for sharp edges. He set it on the table between them. Perhaps, he said, and his mandibles moved in a pattern that the translator could not quite capture. Kale understood anyway. Perhaps we forgot something important. Kale looked at the ancient blade on the table, and he looked at the alien sitting across from him, and he understood that this was not just a gesture, but a confession and a promise, and he smiled, the tired, honest smile of a man who had been through hell and come out the other side carrying the same thing he went in with. He picked up his glass. "Let me buy you a drink," he said. And they sat together in the starlight, a human and an insect, a sergeant and an inspector, two beings from opposite ends of a galaxy that was vast and dark and full of things that wanted to eat you. And between them on the table lay two blades separated by 10,000 years and 100 light years, and the blades caught the light of distant stars and held it, the way sharp things always do, the way they always have, the way they always will.